Welcome. I'm Matt Grossman. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. We are pleased that you could be here with us. You don't all have to be back of the bus, people. If you want, there's front row seats still available and food still available in the back. Sorry that we did promise a pre-K form next time. We will still have that form, and I'm sure some folks will touch on that today, but we will have a full form related to that proposal as well. But we're pleased today to be talking about the now very large state budget, and we're pleased to have an all-star panel who's good at both recognizing the big picture and getting into the weeds with all of your questions about the intricacies of the proposal and how it might move forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Associate Director of IPPSR, Arnold Weinfeld.
Thank you, Dr. Grossman, and again, thank you to everyone for coming out and being with us. Again, move on up. This is meant to be a more informal discussion at the end of the day on the governor's proposed FY 2025 budget. And to help us through that, we have Robert Schneider, who is a senior research associate at the Citizens Research Council for Michigan. And Bob has spent most of his time in state government, having worked in the Office of Health and Human Services, the state budget officer, and as associate director for the Michigan Health Fiscal Agency. This is his second stint actually at CRC. Having been there previously, he has extensive expertise and has provided nonpartisan advice and analysis on state policy and budget matters. After Bob's presentation, we'll get into a discussion with two folks some of you may be familiar with, longtime Capitol correspondents and watchers of all things state government. Zach Gorchow, who's Executive Director and Publisher at Gongwer News Service of Michigan. He leads reporting on the Governor's Office and several state agencies. Zach started his Capitol reporting career a few years ago, shall we say, as a staff writer at Gongwer and also worked at the Detroit Free Press. And Kyle Melinn, who is editor and co-owner of Michigan Information Research Service, otherwise known as MIRS. Kyle, too, has over 20 years of experience covering state government and politics. And so we'll hear from Bob first. We'll get the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts, and then we'll get into some discussion. So Bob?
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. How am I coming through? Good. Glad to be here today. Excited to be able to talk with you about our early stage analysis of the governor's budget recommendation introduced last week. Just so all of you know, we do have a webinar coming up. The Citizens Research Council will do a live webinar next Tuesday. It's at 1 o'clock. If you are interested in joining us, you can register on our website at crcmich.org. You go to our crcmich.org website, click on events, you'll be able to register. We're going to go into more detail. Today I'm going to try to do kind of a high level, where have we been and where are we going with the state budget. It's going to be a little light on getting into specific proposals. We'll do a lot more of that in the webinar. Kind of the framework today is just to try to give you a sense of, okay, here's where we're at, here's where we were at, here's what the governor proposed, and now looking ahead, what does the state's budget outlook look like going forward, with some selected proposals, but we'll do more of that in the webinar. So glad to be here today, and thank you for coming out. I guess I need to thank Matt and Arnold for ordering up the fine weather today for the.
Mr. Reminder, it's still winter in Michigan.
It's fantastic. It was a fun drive. Okay, so let's start looking kind of at the big picture of the situation, the revenue situation that was facing the governor. What were her options? What did revenues look like as she was finalizing her budget proposal? that she just introduced. And so we'll just take a quick look at revenue estimates. Many of you may know every May, every January, state economists gather to do formal revenue forecasts that are then guideposts for budget recommendations and eventually the enrolled budget bill. Here's how things changed for the state's general fund, our big discretionary revenue fund in the state. And revenues were up, but they were up, kind of modestly, anywhere between 1 and about 4%. The biggest changes were in the current fiscal year 24, up almost 3%, and then in fiscal year 26, looking forward, a pretty big, almost a 4% a bump, and that is all, one thing that's important to know, that's all driven basically by the end, there's a proposal that was accepted, a 3-year temporary diversion of corporate income tax out of the general fund and to things like the SOAR fund and housing and community development funds. That ends in 26. So suddenly that money comes back into the general fund, and it's left the governor more options long term for having some extra revenues that she ends up tapping in her budget, and we'll talk about that. But looking at, all right, so what do those revenue adjustments mean to the budget? What room was there for the budget, for the governor to either grow the budget or do tax relief or whatever her budget priorities were? That blue line that you see there are those revenue estimates that we just looked at for the general fund on the last slide. And then the red dotted line there is basically what I call the fiscal year 24 continuation budget. If we don't do anything with the budget, if we just want to carry the budget from last year into this year, how much money do you need to do that? That's that red line. So the gap between the revenue line and the red line is basically how much room there would be to either grow the budget, implement more tax relief, and engage in new priorities for the governor. That gap for the general fund is about $650 million. It's almost 5% growth, which is that's a pretty healthy amount for a budget. And then again, importantly, looking out one more year, we have really strong growth in fiscal year 26. And again, that's that $550 million in redirected general fund coming back. It's not going to be redirected any longer under current law. It would come back into the general fund, which gives the governor even more revenue in the out year as well. So that's good news in a sense, but then that last bullet, just remember last year, if we back up 12 months, that same gap last year was $2.5 billion. Pretty unprecedented gap. We did we grew the budget quite a bit in fiscal year 25, and then that gap last year was also used for substantial tax relief with the retirement tax changes, EITC, and that diversion that we just talked about from corporate income tax. School aid fund, the forecasters hit it almost right on the head in last May. So May estimates are in blue, the new January estimates in orange, very modest upward adjustment, less than 1%, almost rounding error then at that point. So really the school aid fund revenues held to expectations. And so we can do that same analysis now with the school aid fund. How much room was there for the governor? What options did she have to grow the school aid fund? Basically, as we look at the gap between revenues and then again a continuation budget, if we just carried in the school aid budget from last year, there's room for about $550 million in growth. That's around 3%. Again, a decent, not a phenomenal growth rate, but a decent growth rate, one that's going to probably meet or exceed inflation. But again, if we back up 12 months, that gap last year, that room to grow the budget was $1.3 billion. So a return to normal, a more normal looking budget, a more normal looking gap or room to grow. We're getting back to how things look more in 2019, 2018, 2017. The other important thing to know is we have been we've had some phenomenal, aside from the gap between ongoing revenue and ongoing spending, we have had phenomenal money in the bank, as we call it, these fund reserves, year-end fund reserves that grew post-COVID. And remember, back in 2020, we thought the sky was falling. We thought we were going to lose $6 billion in state revenue. We ended up cutting the budget in 2020, 2021 in anticipation of lost revenue. And then we found out, you know what, we're not losing revenue, we're actually gaining revenue. Things like federal stimulus from the Paycheck Protection Program, enhanced unemployment benefits, 3 rounds of tax rebates, fueled lots of, even though earnings were going down, it more than offset the lost earnings from employment losses. We got a ton of revenue, and since we weren't spending it, it all fell into fund balances until we finally caught up and started drawing those down. 2 years ago, we had, if you looked at the school aid fund, general fund, those 2 major discretionary revenue funds for the state, we had a $12 billion fund balance. That's now fallen. Current estimates at the end of the current fiscal year 24, in September, the combined balance should be closer to $1.7 billion, much smaller than it has been in recent years. But if we look back, more than it was, back 5, 6, 7 years ago. So still healthy balances. So the governor has room to grow in terms of ongoing spending and ongoing revenue, there being more revenue than what you need to carry forward last year's budget, but also some one-time revenue to draw on. And we'll see the governor actually use some of that general fund one-time balance that still is left to actually supplement some ongoing spending increases, knowing that extra $550 million was going to come back to the general fund next year, and managed to do that in a way that we'll see is sustainable, but kind of redirect some of that one-time fund balance into ongoing spending. Just long-term perspective, that's kind of where we're at now. It's important, we put this chart in all the time in our presentations. It is important to remember, if we go back 20 years to the beginning of the century, Michigan had a horrible 2000 to 2010, both kind of economic doldrums in the state, and tax policy changes meant to try to address those doldrums. Led to a significant decline. That orange line is actual general fund revenue. It fell for 10 years pretty significantly. Since then, we've had it rebound. We've had consistent growth in our general fund, but that blue line underneath is inflation-adjusted general fund revenue. And even though it started to catch up, it's something that doesn't jump to everyone's attention. Our general fund, after adjusting for inflation, is still down by a little more than 24% from where it was back 25 years ago. So that state general fund budget also is lower than it was at that time. So I want to talk about some highlights of the budget, and again, we're going to kind of selectively pick a few things to talk about, but if you're interested in more detail, we're going to have a lot more of that at our webinar next Tuesday. My colleague, Craig Thiel, I see him sitting at a table in the back. He'll be joining me. Craig is our K-12 expert, and I'm going to handle the general fund side of the budget, and we'll be walking through more details on some of the specific budget proposals. This will just give you a flavor for some of the big ones that I think are getting attention. And then we'll move to sort of a long-term outlook for the budget going forward. So, big picture, here's some interesting, at least to budget wonks, these are interesting numbers. You can tell me if they're interesting to you. The total appropriations, the whole budget from all sources, federal, state money, everything that funds the budget, fiscal year 24 was $80.7 billion. The proposal that just came out, fiscal year 25, $80.7 billion. The budget between 24 and 25 in its totality from all sources has stayed the same. But it's interesting to look at the general fund and the school aid, those two big state discretionary funds that shape 95+% of budget deliberations, and you see a significant change in the composition of those proposals. General fund, ongoing general fund. So in other words, the general fund that's appropriated as this is going to keep going and will be carried into the next year. In fiscal year 2024, it was $12.8 billion. It grew by $885 million, almost 7%. And you see a similar, smaller growth, but a similar pattern with the school aid fund. Ongoing appropriations grew by $450 million, 2.5%. Notice though the one-time revenue. When we budget appropriations, we designate some things as ongoing, and then there are things that, well, these are one-time appropriations. A signal, we're going to budget this next year, but we're not counting on having it anymore beyond that. Notice how significantly that those one-time appropriations went down. We still have more than $1.5 billion in the 25 proposal, but last year we had, adding those numbers up, about $4 billion in one-time revenue. So this budget hasn't grown much, but the budget proposal in 25 is much more ongoing, permanent appropriations in the budget, and we have greatly reduced the amount of one-time appropriations that exist. So most of this budget, a greater percentage is going to carry forward into next year, and there's less reliance or less use of one-time appropriations. To that point, I just want to skip ahead. I should have changed the order of these slides. Excuse me, needed a little drink there. So let's look at the perspective then on this. I think one of the messages that we'll be conveying in our webinar is this budget is kind of a return to normal. And what we have here is, each bar here is the total state budget, called adjusted gross appropriations, but effectively means all the money. Everything from federal sources, everything from all sources that go into the state budget. But it's adjusted gross, the total budget, but it's inflation adjusted. So this is all in fiscal year 24 dollars. How much would we have needed back in those earlier years if we had price levels where they're at right now? And this is very interesting. I was actually very surprised that this chart turned out the way it did. If we go back to those years prior to COVID, we were on a pretty smooth trend line in terms of growing the budget. And people ask us all the time, my goodness, the budget was $58 billion, the total budget in fiscal year 19. By fiscal year 23, it's $85 billion, phenomenal growth. So what happened? And this is just a perspective of trying to explain exactly what was driving things. If you look for a long time, that growth trend that we plot out for inflation-adjusted appropriations, we were well above it. And that was driven, and notice too, that blue section that's federal money, that's the driver. We had immense amounts of federal appropriations, most of it one time or limited in duration, and that blew up that budget very significantly. What else was going on? We had high inflation, much higher than normal inflation, and that also helps drive the budget up. But notice we have now weaned off that big federal boost and some of the state revenue boost that we did get in the early COVID period. We are now back off that. And really this fiscal year 25 budget proposal, again, which is heavy on ongoing expenditures, really is a return to normal. We've kind of weaned off of this temporary largesse or whatever term you want to use for it, and we've gotten back to, and I was surprised. So if you had asked me in fiscal year 2019, Bob, project to me what you think, and that's before I knew what COVID was, before we had new CARES Act and American Rescue Plan, what do you think the fiscal year 25 budget would look like? And you told me, oh, by the way, we're gonna have a bout of inflation. It's gonna be, 8% in 2022 and 6% in 2023 and much higher than normal. And you gave me those numbers and you asked me to project what I thought the budget would be. It would be that. It would be exactly that. And I don't even need to know about COVID to make that projection. So really the budget in the whole is kind of back to that long run in trend once you adjust for inflation and account for that as a factor. Okay, so let's skip back now. One important element of this year's budget is K-12. Here I outline about $950 million in new ongoing investments in the K-12 budget. The foundation allowance increases, money for mental health, Great Start Readiness, and the kind of the universal expansion of that, taking away income eligibility requirements. That's a lot of money. And remember, a few slides ago, I told you we only had room for $540 million. So how do you get $940 million when we only have room for $540 million? You have to shuffle money around. So let's talk about that. So the governor is proposing a change in the state's appropriations to meet MIPSR's, the Michigan Public School Employees Retirement System, pension liabilities. And it's important to know, and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible here. There's two elements to the pension plan. We pay pensions, and we need to have money in the pension fund now based on how long we think people are going to live and what kind of return we're going to get on the pension fund, and a whole bunch of actuarial assumptions. We need to have enough in our pension fund to be able to meet those long-term liabilities. We don't right now. We're about 64% funded. We have $35 billion on the pension side in unfunded liabilities. And if we continue to meet actual planned payments, it's supposed to be paid down by 2038. There's another element of the retirement system, retiree health care. The same thing. We need to be able to pay for those health care benefits into the future with money we have in the fund now. If you look at that side of it, we are pretty much fully paid up. So we have enough and that component of the healthcare system to meet those future liabilities. The issue is, back in 2018, the legislature passed legislative requirements that we want to get there faster. We want to reach being paid off and fully funded quicker than the actuaries would tell us to do. So the law says whatever you paid last year, regardless of what the actuaries tell you need to pay, you're going to, at a minimum, keep that up. You're going to keep making that payment, and it didn't distinguish between those two separate funds, those two separate segments of the retirement system. So under that rule, we would keep making these payments, even though we're fully funded on health. The added payments would help us get on the pension side fully funded a little bit quicker. So the governor has proposed a statutory change to say, let's separate those two components. Let's look at the health side and let's look at the pension side, and we'll continue to meet the actuarial requirements for pensions, and if there's at least pay as much as you did last year. But now that we're paid up on the health side, let's take that $670 million that we would have, I think in some minds, overpaid or paid more than the actuaries required in order to accelerate getting to 100% on the whole. We won't do that anymore. We're going to take that and we're going to reinvest that in other areas of school aid. And that gave the governor room to do expansion, to expand programs according to the available revenue, but now you have $670 million in additional school aid revenue that's not going to go to the healthcare pension payments as required by this maintain last year's contribution. Instead, it's going to be redirected to to other priorities that she has proposed in the school aid budget. So a quick discussion of that. Again, we're going to hear more about that at our webinar next week. So a couple other things. One big recent driver of budget growth has been student financial aid programs. The governor proposes another $50 million increase, 30 for the Michigan Achievement Scholarships, that new program. That's the purple segment at the bottom of each of those bars. $20 million for the tuition incentive program. So another smaller boost, but still a boost for financial aid. On the other side of things, we have two existing programs, longer-term programs, that given the new Michigan Achievement Scholarship, the governor is proposing to phase those out, the Michigan Competitive Scholarships and the Michigan Tuition Grants. So those top two bars will gradually be phased out as the Achievement Scholarship amounts rise over time. Local revenue sharing, subject we always sort of try to hit in our webinars. 5% growth for local governments on a permanent basis, and then equivalent to 5% growth on a one-time basis. Local governments, counties, cities, villages, townships will get a boost. But again, looking long term, revenue sharing was another area where that was hit hard by the bad times we had between 2000 and 2010. And even with the growth that we've had since then, we're still about, I think it's 35% down in inflation adjusted terms in revenue sharing. Where am I at here? Just I only want to take a couple more minutes, and so I'll get through this last segment pretty quickly. Long-term budget outlook then, again, we talked about this slide, we're back to normal. The budget looks like it's back to where it was in the trajectory that we were at in 2016, 17, 18, 19 before COVID hit us in the face. The governor did have some tax policy proposals, a research and development tax credit and a caregiver's tax credit that will, much smaller tax adjustments than she proposed last year. Those will reduce the revenue estimates that we talked about earlier. So if we want to look like long-term, now with the governor's budget proposal in place, let's say it passes as it was proposed. So what does that mean for 26 then? What does that leave us for next year? On the general fund side, once we account for the tax proposal changes and we look at what the new general fund continuation budget would be, how much now we would need to carry into next year, into 26, we don't have a whole lot of room for growth. Probably inflationary, about $320 million, about 2.3%. So next year's general fund budget, if the governor's proposal comes to fruition, fairly tight, 2.5% growth. And on the school aid side, even tighter, probably about 1% growth. Only room for about $200 million in growth on the school aid fund side. So in both cases, those fund balances that we talked about, that money in the bank, again, under this budget proposal would largely be wiped out. We'd have very, very small fund balances next year. So again, a tighter budget, both on the general fund side and on the school aid fund side. And then just to close with, with the big question mark of the income tax. So we, as many of you probably know, the income tax rate was at least now temporarily reduced from 4.25% to 4.05% for tax year 2023. That's supposed to go back. A Court of Appeals ruling so far has held up the state's contention that a plain reading of the law would suggest that goes back to 4.25% in 2024. What if it doesn't? What if somebody else says, another court says, you know what, no, I read it different. That should stay in place on a permanent basis, which, by the way, was very clearly the intent of the legislature, but we've blogged about this. If you do read the plain language, at least in my opinion, and folks can disagree, I do think that the language reads like it would go back to 4.25%. But what if it doesn't? This is the impact. We lose $530 million in fiscal year '24, and then $760 million permanently into the future. That basically torpedoes the budget proposal, and you would not be able to sustain. We have an immediate problem of about $1.3 billion, even before we complete the 25 budget. So either major budget revisions would need to be had, new revenue would need to be found, revenue would need to be redirected from other areas of the budget to make this budget proposal work, and on a very large scale. So if that comes to place, throw everything out the window. You're going to need to rethink about what happens with the 25 and 26 budget proposals. So I think I barely met my 25 minutes, long-winded again a little bit. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Arnold. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate you laying the framework for the continuing discussion. And we're going to now have that discussion with both Zach and Kyle, both of who have discussed the budget proposal and I won't call them gimmicks, but the money shifts that is predicated on. So Zach, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Well, Kyle and I were sort of going through, first of all, it's great to be here today. Appreciate a great crowd on a tough weather day. Kyle and I were kind of going through and trying to figure out what items were kind of the biggest headlines that popped for us. So I think we're going to kind of flip back and forth here. And I guess I'll start it off with the one we both sort of agreed was first was this is a big budget. You'll probably hear a little bit of a difference in what we have to say compared to Bob, from that graphic that you showed showing the trajectory, that this sort of resumed the upward growth that had been in place before COVID was definitely really informative. But I would say from a more of a political standpoint, this is not normal. This is not a return to normal. This is still a very generous budget compared to the relatively lean increases during the Schneider era, where programs had to meet certain thresholds to get funding increases. There were not inflationary increases for a whole lot of program lines. It was generally a lot leaner, and no question, things that are coming back down. And like I said, I feel more, as often is the case when I hear Bob or anyone from the CRC talk, I feel much more educated, seeing how this aligns with the pre-COVID trend. But there's still a lot of new spending here and a lot of attempts to maintain a lot of the growth that took place during the COVID era. And I think we'll get into some of the components of that. And I think probably one of the biggest ones, I'll flip it to Kyle, take it on.
Yeah, on that point, yeah, I would say this, a return to normal. I think it's like maybe it's a new normal. I mean, the rate of inflation was at what, 8%, 6.5% a couple of years ago. And so the number that we see here with $81 billion compared to when we were in the $50 billion just in 2019, it's very eye-catching. So continuing on these big budgets and this drastic change in numbers, I think was the biggest headline. When Zach's talking about budgets in the general fund, year after year, 10 billion, 10 billion, 10 billion, 10.5, 10.6. And we were in that kind of strata for like 10 years. And now all of a sudden we're at 14.5. So where did this come from? Meanwhile, the corrections budget has been $2 billion, like I think since I started in 2001, I swear to God. But now it's now it's the same thing. But our regular budget just continues to swell. And going to, and that kind of dovetails into our second big headline from this, is that using this leftover OPEB money, or reallocating money that would have otherwise gone to retiree health care and spending it on other priorities in the governor's budget. She had some specific ideas she has with this $670 million. She's targeted some of this money to go to an increase in at-risk special ed funding. for mental health, school safety programs, $150 million she'd like to put into that. She wants to continue the free lunch, $200 million. Again, this is money, 670, that she needs the legislature to sign off on, but it would be to continue these expanded programs or expanded programs that she would like to see. And I don't know about you, Zach, but I'm not quite sure that's going to pass, get immediate effect in the Senate.
You know, Bob, I think, laid it out well. Like, I asked the question in my weekly column last week, is the governor's budget fragile? And I think it is an open question, because if a court were to rule that the income tax needs to go back to 4.05%, that's about $650 million for the upcoming year. There's I think it was 760 you said, is that right?
On the general fund side.
All right, right.
You're right, overall, 700 million.
Right, and you've got a current year problem, but then what if the legislature balks at this idea of saying, we're not gonna commit that $670 million to pre-funding retiree health care like we used to. We want that money to keep going into MEPSers. Let's pour it into the pension side. Well, all of a sudden, you've got like a $2 billion problem. And that's real money. That's a big number. And so I think that's what, one of the reasons we had this as one of our bigger headlines is what looks like a, hunky-dory, isn't this a great budget, yay, programs, new spending, could get a lot dicier really quickly with just two decisions. But that sort of takes us to our third big headline, which is the COVID money is mostly gone. And boy, that was just such a shocking thing to witness the last few years for anyone who has followed the budget for a long time, to see just, billions and billions and billions of money pouring in, the fund balances. And I think the clearest way we're seeing that manifest itself is we're not going to have, at least I don't think we're going to have, billions of dollars in what some will call enhancement grants and others will call PORC. These are the $1 million for this project here, $2 million to remove a dam there, $1 million for this nonprofit that's doing good work over here. And so on and so forth, until all of a sudden you have what we had in the current year budget, which was billions of these projects. And I think, why is that? It's important for multiple reasons. One is, local governments out there and others are not going to be able to line up like they did before and say, hey, we have these overdue investments, we need help, can we get them? But most of this legislature, particularly in the House, does not know how to pass a budget without, I guess to put it politely, getting something for their district. That was key to getting yes votes. Hey, yeah, I'd love to vote yes on the budget, but this bridge in my district needs to be fixed, or this ice rink in my district, the HVAC system's busted. We need to do something about that. There were scores of these, unprecedented number of these projects, and it really helped grease the skids, not only to get the yes votes necessary, but to get the immediate effect votes necessary in the Senate. And so that is going to be something to watch, is how do these legislators, particularly in the House, who don't know anything else. In the Senate, a lot of them, they know what a pre-COVID budget, how it's built and what needs to be done. But they don't know anything else, and it's going to be really interesting to see how they get it done.
Yeah, so to that point, we took a look at the budget page, the state budget office. How much COVID money do we have left? According to the budget office, $20 billion of it has already been spent. And there's $4.66 billion remaining, according to the budget office. So 70% of the COVID money has already been spent. To Zach's point, the COVID money didn't necessarily go from the feds to the state to these local governments, but what it did do is that it opened up opportunities in other parts of the budget. So we were able to use COVID money here, so that frees up general fund money there, and now all of a sudden we could pay for these special roads and bridges. And actually, our Samantha Schreiber, who's here in person, calculated out at $2 billion, I think, in special goodies once upon it when we calculated it. But yeah, with this COVID money going away, I would agree, Zach. that's not going to continue the way that it has. So the fourth big headline that we saw in this budget is the transition toward this MyLeap, this new department that the governor has created to oversee pre-K education and then higher education and then continue training past K through 12. And now she is using this new department as opposed to doing her own, the Michigan Department of Education, which is run by a superintendent who she does not appoint. She doesn't appoint the board members who appoint the superintendent, and so she has really no real control over this body. So like other governors, like Schneider or Engler, who try to find creative runaways or go-arounds, she has found her own go-around because her and Mike Rice, the superintendent, didn't necessarily see eye to eye on the COVID restrictions, and so they're not necessarily on the same page. And so she's created this new department that is going to be spending upwards to $500 million that otherwise would have been spent by the Department of Education. So now this new MyLeap program, or a department, it's a department, is actually spending more money than the Department of Education. She's just created this new department, and now things like child care, the community college program, that's kind of the community college budget, but the oversight for all of this money is now moved to this MyLeap. And the Board of Ed isn't happy about it. For the first time, I think Tom McMillan and Pamela Pugh are agreeing on something, which, if you follow the Board of Ed, you realize how significant that is. They tried to have a lengthy discussion on it, but I think the Democrats on the board wanted to see how deep they wanted to get into criticizing the governor, because McMillan was ready to go all in. So they're going to talk about that, but that's my number 4 storyline, is moving money away from the Department of Ed.
So I think, one of the things that really stood out to me was, with this budget, was limited new programs, but an attempt to accelerate the expansion of others. And one of those was speeding up the full implementation of state-funded preschool for all 4-year-olds. So Michigan, for many years, has had a program, as you probably know, called the Great Start Readiness Program, but it's had very significant income eligibility limitations. My recollection is right now, I think it's like 400 family income level has to be about 400% of the poverty level or less to be eligible. The governor had wanted to fully phase it in, so all 4-year-olds are eligible, I believe, by FY26, so 1 more year out, or effectively 2 more years out. So she wants to speed it up and say, we're going to have it fully in place for the upcoming fiscal year that starts October 1. There's, I think, still a lot of questions about how that is working so far. What is the uptake? What's the usage? And so forth, but certainly sounds good, and there's certainly widespread agreement that preschool is good. I think that's pretty clear. So, how much of a difference will it make? To be clear, obviously a lot of people, have transportation issues, and there are, certainly lots of people paying for preschool and pre-kindergarten right now. Will they use Great Start Readiness Program? Will they continue with their own program? So that's one big piece. The other one is, in many ways, a new program, which is the idea of having the state fund 2 years of tuition for community college students. This is part of a wide-ranging state financial aid scholarship reworking overhaul that we'll talk about in a little more detail in a little bit. Community colleges, needless to say, love this. Thrilled. They've been, dealing with declining student counts. This is clearly a way to improve chances for increasing enrollment and so forth. And it sort of, in a way, is a piece of the governor's Growing Michigan Together Council recommendations that called for something along these lines. Now, it was much more dramatic. The idea was more or less to try to integrate our extremely balkanized education system, where we have 550 separately run K-12 school districts. We have private K-12 schools, we have 28 community colleges, we have 15 public universities, and something like 30 private colleges and universities, and a whole other bunch of entities I don't need to run through. But needless to say, trying to turn that whole ship on a dime, you really can't do it, and that was part of the idea of the Growing Michigan Together Council plan was, let's go to like a K-14 type system. Well, the governor's not proposing that because that would be an enormous challenge, but she is saying, let's have the state fund 2 years of community college, almost like a de facto K-14 plan. So community colleges are thrilled. Who's not thrilled? Big surprise, the public universities are not happy about this. Why? Because other than the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan State University, and Grand Valley State University, pretty much everybody else is in an enrollment crisis, and the other public universities to varying degrees. And if all of a sudden they're seeing people who would have gone, Central, Western, Ferris State, etc., if they're seeing students who would have enrolled as freshmen there say, you know what, I'll do my 2 years of community college, the state's going to pick up the tab, I can live at home, not pay room and board, and then I'll transfer. Think about what that's going to mean for them. The enrollment declines at places like Central and others are quite serious. So they're not happy, they'd like to see this apply to them too.
All right, so our number 6 headline that we had is the change in the economic development strategy. Remember when we had Shirkey and Chatfield in office, the focus, or Wentworth, the focus was on this Strategic Outreach and Attraction Reserve Fund. And we were going to put $1 billion into that, and boy, did that just fly right out. Well, now, after the Democratic House is kind of reflected on this and wondered if that was the best use of money, the governor has kind of retooled her message on how to attract business to the state. Now, she still has $500 million in this budget for the SOAR fund. But she didn't lead with that. Instead, she led with more technology innovation type programs, $60 million for the Michigan Innovation Fund, for example. She wants to bring out this tried and true, what it was called at the time, Good Jobs. It's now being called Hire, but it's basically allowing companies to keep the income tax that they collect from their employees that would have otherwise gone to the state. They're going to be able to keep that money as a way to help the project that they just did, whether it's a renovation project or whatever, help balance out the books. So she wants to bring that back. She's focused on that. She's got $150 million for targeted energy investment. Of course, housing continues to be a big focus of hers. So our number 6 here was just, though, a general refocus away from big grants to big people like General Motors or Goshen, since those are being used as political tools by Republicans, and moving it toward maybe smaller individuals. They took this, the Good Job program I'd mentioned, and lowered down the threshold, so it's no longer big fish who get to apply for this thing. It's people who are going to try and bring in dozens of jobs as opposed to hundreds of jobs.
All right, next big headline. I'm starting to feel like the old David Letterman show here.
We're not as funny, though.
No, we are definitely not as funny. The tipping fee. What is the tipping fee? The governor has dusted off another tried and true favorite from the 2000s, a proposal to increase the tax that landfill owners pay on disposing and hosting of out-of-state waste. I don't know how far back everyone here goes, but in the 2000s, the Democrats, then in the minority in the House, made a huge case out of saying Michigan is importing too much garbage and our landfills are overrun with out-of-state garbage, particularly from Canada, and the state should increase the tipping fee on landfills to deter other states and Canada from sending their garbage to Michigan. So the governor dusted this off and says, yep, let's increase it, raise it to collect a total of $80 million of new money. This is another move to try to maintain the increased spending that has taken place in recent years. The governor's taken great pride in pumping a lot of money into environmental remediation, drinking water protection, and so forth. And this would generate $80 million to help go toward that.
All right, we got to reserve some room for questions, so I'm just going to kind of blow through the rest of these so we can get to questions. Number 8 on our list was the end of bonding money for our transportation system. This is the last year of the governor's bonding program, where she's been able to collect money from the bond market and use it to fund the roads, kind of like how Engler did. A lot of that Engler money is being paid off, and now Whitmer's got a new batch out there to be paid off. With that, the infrastructure money, if you're interested, from the Biden Infrastructure Act, we're supposed to get $11 billion, and that stretches to 2026. So by the time Whitmer leaves office, well, how about that? We don't have federal money anymore. We won't have the bonding money anymore. So yeah, you can go ahead and raise the tax now on gas if you'd like to do that. All right, and then number 9, we had mentioned that the expanded use of TANF money, that there is a desire to take it away from education for scholarships and using it more for disposable income for folks who are poor. They can use it on different things. They have an expanded ability to use that. And then number 10, the tax credit for working families that the governor put out there. We also thought that would be our number 10 headline. But I know we're running close on time, so let's go ahead and take some questions, Arlen.
Kyle, why don't you tell us what TANF stands for?
Temporary need aid
Assistance with needy
family. Yeah, there you go.
We were using it for scholarships, okay. Yeah, we have a lot of questions. Tony, you want to move the mic around? Before we get to the questions, I have one for the two of you. As you noted, the budget is predicated on some shifts of money. One of those impacts one of the Democrats' larger constituency, school employees. $670 million. Now, the House Dems are probably going to likely get back 2 of their seats, and it'll be 56, 54 again this spring. What problems do you see, though, for the Dems moving forward on this $670 million shift?
I've put in a request to the Michigan Education Association for their thoughts on this, and they said they'd get back to me. This is a concern. One thing that I had a source in the education space tell me is, there's a lot of public school employees who are having 3% of their pay get redirected to MIRS, for health care. And, if the state suddenly says, well, we aren't contributing anymore, that's going to create a lot of headaches. So I think, this is going to be a difficult challenge for the governor because, one, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to get immediate effect for it. I don't see the Republicans going along with it, so stretch out the effective date 6 months or 3 months into 2025. And then you're going to have to potentially overcome not only what appears to be the opposition of the traditional public school community, but also possibly the teachers' unions who haven't weighed in yet, which would become a huge problem if it happens.
Yeah, I would think that the teacher unions in the end would like this because it's more money that is being pumped into school districts. With the expanded preschool, there's going to be a mad dash for these school districts to hire teachers to teach these 4-year-old kids. Because if they don't have the teachers on staff, they may have to contract with private vendors to do this preschool. And the MEA doesn't want to see that. They want to see these school districts to be able to expand and have their preschools on site so they can have union teachers. So as to the extent that this money can be used to pay for those schools, or those kids, and they can get those union members quicker, I would think that they'd want this. The school districts, though, absolutely don't want this. This is a bad deal for them because if the state isn't picking up the tab on MIPSers for the pensions, they have to pay it up. And that means that they don't have the expendable revenue. So there will be pressure, I think, from traditional school groups to not do this.
Yeah, I think that given the governor and the legislative Democrats trumpeting the end of the retiree tax, generally speaking, it's going to be very difficult, especially with the House being up for election, to go back out and campaign on, well, you got rid of the retiree tax, but now you're coming on the back end and you're hitting my pension in this manner. So I think there's going to be a problem with this $670 million. Lindsay?
You want to steal my glory? I was going to talk about partisan politics. Great presentation, gentlemen. How much will the presidential election and the partisanship play a role into the decision making between both chambers when it comes down to the final decision on this, you think?
I think you'd be surprised how quickly they can get a budget done, though, in an election year, especially with the House up. It seems like when we have had shutdowns in government, just think about this, 2007, 2009, and then Whitmer's first year in 2019. Those are the budgets that we had the government shut down and all sorts of brinksmanship, and they were not election years. When it is election year, it seems like the legislature get their act together a lot quicker. They are able to resolve their differences a lot faster because they don't want this hanging over their head while they're going door to door.
Yeah, I don't foresee the presidential election really complicating this. I mean, I think we will likely see something similar to last year, where it's going to be more or less a partisan line vote in the House and the Senate for the budgets, and the question will be, how do Senators Brinks and Nesbitt negotiate over the immediate effect piece to avoid a real big problem, which both of them seem committed to preventing from happening.
Back?
Has anybody estimated the potential cost of not only the $670 million that wouldn't go toward the pension UAL, but any additional cost with regard to what could have come in or be saved with the market changes and things like that?
I don't have to go back up. So, I mean, if I'm understanding your question, right, I mean, it's kind of the great unknown, right? Because you could, if we don't make so what will happen is there would be no real UAL requirement. The actuaries would tell us, you're funded, largely funded. There'd be a tiny payment towards the healthcare UAL. But again, if we follow the current rules, the current law, that would go and help us get more funded, a higher percentage funded on the pension side. What else could happen? If we have a bad year in the market, those all of a sudden we're lower in terms of how funded we are. On the opposite end, if we have a really good year, unexpected, and we exceed those actuarial assumptions, we're going to get quicker, get closer to 100%. So I guess when I think about it that way, there's all those are. Will those actuarial assumptions be recognized, or will we miss up or down, and that's going to affect where we're at? So I'm not sure we know. I'm not sure we're able to forecast that, but it's a risk. I mean, if we had a severe recession and we don't meet the assumptions behind what the pension fund is going to earn, all of a sudden we're going to be back down below. So
yeah, and recall that in statute we have the consensus revenue estimating conference. So we'll come back around in May, and the economists and the state treasurer and the House Fiscal and the Senate Fiscal Agency will again do their best to take a look at the revenues that have come in and where they think the revenues are going for the rest of the year as well. Craig, you got
Let me just follow up on Ann's question because it's important.
Craig, why don't you identify yourself?
I'll follow up on Ann's question here about the pension reforms. And in addition to this funding floor we've talked about, the legislature has inserted itself in pension funding, basically going back to the Schneider administration and then up through current times. And they've attempted to pull volatility and risk out of pension funding in two ways, which are important to this. One, Bob mentioned how the market does. At the time that this funding floor was put in place, the assumption was that our investments across all the pension systems, or teacher pension system, were going to generate 8% per year returns. Because of the reforms, we're now assuming 6%. So, and we've subsequently funded the system to take that risk, that 2 percentage point risk out of the system. So that, so we have an ability to miss a wider margin to miss now because it's not 8, it's 6%. And similarly, another assumption that goes into pension funding is what's going to happen to the base of that you're levying these the contributions on, and basically the payroll. And for years, we assumed that school payrolls were going to increase 3.5% per year when we had declining enrollment and fewer teachers in the system, and payroll was actually declining. So now we're at 0% assumed payroll growth. So again, taking risk out of the system. So these reforms have had the effect of removing the volatility that plagued us from a budget standpoint back in the early 2000s when, oh look, we had payrolls decrease, we thought they're going to increase, now we got to put a whole bunch of more money in the system. We had the market turndowns in the early 2000s. We weren't predicting that. Instead of an 8% growth, we have a negative growth. Well, now the measure is 6%. So there has been substantial de-risking, de-volatilization of the pension system to ensure its longevity.
Thanks, Craig. Craig Thiel, also from the Citizens Research Council. We have another question up here.
What happened to paid leave? I didn't hear it in the state message, or it's not in the budget. And there is a court case hanging out there, about paid leave. That was a ballot question, and that's hanging out there too.
So yeah, the paid family leave, this was something Governor Whitmer proposed in her August speech that she called her What's Next speech. She didn't propose anything specifically, but made it clear she thought there should be an extended paid family and medical leave system in the state of Michigan. Her people in her administration were telling folks around town they were looking at Minnesota as a model, which, if memory serves, you could do 12 weeks for sick leave or 12 weeks for a new baby, and maybe 20 if you total for the year, something like that. I always hate to say that something is dead because something will suddenly materialize later, but this proposal just seems to have immediately died. There is no apparent traction for it beyond the most devoted Democratic legislators and activist groups. There were bills introduced already when the governor made this proposal that I believe were 15 weeks, if I recall. There's not been a hearing on them, and we've asked Speaker Tate, and Speaker Tate is a very judicious person. He's not just going to come out and say, yeah, we're not doing that. But you read between the lines, they're not doing that. It's not so much the idea, what's wrong with paid family leave. It was this idea of standing up a big new government agency, applying a substantial new payroll tax to employers and employees. I think, Speaker Tate and other Democrats just said, we might as well just hand the Republicans the keys to the Speaker's office now if we attempt to do this. And so it has gone nowhere. And when we asked Governor Whitmer this a couple of weeks ago about had she given up on paid family leave, and she said no. Then she mentioned, hey, I got this caregiver credit. And it really seems like that is the salve they're trying to apply to disappointed Democratic activists that this is not going to happen. No real details on this caregiver credit yet. We don't really know exactly who's eligible, how much it would be, what the total cost is. So a lot of details still to be heard.
You also mentioned on the ballot proposal front, and we haven't heard much on the ballot proposal front, but Democrats have become increasingly organized as it relates to this election, and there is a concentrated effort not to agitate the business community if they don't have to. Because if you take a look at polling, the business community is doing just as well with Democrats as it is with Republicans. The polling it used to be, if you were in the business community, you were a Republican, and that was just the way it is. The polling now would indicate that it's almost split. And to not poke the bear of the business community and get them agitated and get them involved for Republicans is something that is on the mind of the Democrats. So I would be surprised if we see this as a ballot initiative, because it doesn't drive out the vote the way they want it to drive out the vote. And that's what this election is going to be. It's going to be to drive out your base and get them excited, get to the polls. And what this does is this excites the business community and not to their benefit.
Oh my gosh, I almost started coughing once I grabbed the microphone. So I want to ask about the Michigan Achievement Scholarship. And the way that program was designed in 2022, there needs to be a $50 million extra deposit added onto it until fiscal year 2028. So when you look at it, the Michigan Achievement Scholarship could be a $380 million program this next fiscal year. With all of that being said, as people that were around during the Great Recession when Michigan Promise got canceled out, do you think the Michigan Achievement Scholarship is sustainable? What type of lifeline do you think it's actually going to have?
Yeah, you wonder how they're going to solidify that, Sam, because you're exactly right. The Michigan Promise, remember that? The promise that was broken.
Yes.
And how sad was that, And so to prevent, how do you prevent that same thing from happening, Samantha? That's a great question. They're going to have to deal with that on the legislative front so that people don't feel like they're going to get promised something again and just get jobbed, because without some type of sustainable revenue going forward, how does something like that get passed? I think that's going to be the big question as they look into whether they really want to balloon that achievement scholarship and actually go in this direction.
Any other thoughts from the three of you as we close? What can we expect over the next, February? 4 months as we head down to work on the budget?
A lot of committee meetings. A lot of committee meetings in the House. Not a lot of floor action.
Okay. Right now they seem stuck on floor action. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a quick flash question. Do you think we'll ever see the $100 billion budget in our lifetime?
In our lifetime? How long? In your lifetime, but maybe not mine. Maybe not my career. But you know what? We're getting there. I mean, we're at $80 billion, just the cost of inflation. If it's at 3%, what is that? Maybe 7 years?
It's 25% above what it is now. It'll get there someday for sure.
What's interesting is that $100 billion budget, but how much of that will be a general fund increase? So where is our money coming from? We've noted that the general fund today is what? 25% smaller than what it should be from 2000?
In inflation adjusted,
yeah.
it's higher in real dollars,
Right.
in actual dollars,
Right.
but
So
down in
I
inflation.
think when everyone talks about the $100 billion budget, Michigan's $80 billion budget, I've been here a long time, and that general fund number has really not moved a whole heck of a lot. And when you look at the Headley requirement, I think we've lost count as to how far we are below the Headley requirement at this point. So, thank you all for being here today, and look for announcement of our next forum.